Engineers saw a veteran janitor fixing a dead Humvee. Moments later, the base commander found out. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Imagine this, a group of engineers, armed with the latest diagnostic equipment, struggling to bring a dead Humvee back to life. The vehicle had been sitting in the sun for hours, and despite their best efforts, it refused to start. Frustration mounted as the engineers poked and prodded at every part of the vehicle, trying to figure out what went wrong. But the Humvee remained silent. The noise of the engine bay echoed in the garage as one of the engineers, frustrated, slammed the hood shut. "This thing's a piece of junk," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "We're wasting time. We need to call the higher-ups." The others nodded in agreement, their faces a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. It was then that a quiet figure entered the scene. He was an old man, wearing a faded gray jumpsuit, his hair a mop of silver, and his face weathered with age. He had been working at the base for years, mostly keeping the place clean and tidy. No one had ever paid much attention to him, just another janitor with a mop in his hand. But today, he walked over to the Humvee without saying a word. The engineers barely noticed him at first, until one of them scoffed. "What? You gonna fix it, Grandpa?" He laughed, clearly mocking the old man's age. The janitor didn't flinch. He simply knelt beside the Humvee and started inspecting the engine. His hands were steady, his movements precise, like someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The engineers exchanged glances. They thought he was crazy. "That's the problem with you old guys," one of them said. "You think you can fix everything, but we've got computers for that." But the janitor didn't respond. Instead, he reached for the battery terminals, tightening a loose connection. With a calm focus. "What's he doing?" one engineer asked, barely containing his curiosity. "No idea," another engineer replied, but they were all watching now. The old man moved quickly, almost effortlessly, as if the vehicle had spoken to him. His hands knew exactly where to go, and within minutes, he had checked the fuel line and the starter motor, adjusting a few things here and there. After a few more minutes of working in silence, the old man stood up and wiped his hands on his jumpsuit. "Try it now," he said, his voice calm but firm. One of the engineers hesitated before turning the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life. The engineers froze, staring in disbelief. "How did you?" one of them began, but he couldn't finish the sentence. The janitor didn't answer. He simply stood there, watching the engine hum with quiet satisfaction. At that moment, the base commander walked in. He had heard the commotion from his office and was curious to see what was going on. When he saw the Humvee running again, his eyes narrowed, and he turned to the engineers. "Who did this?" he asked. The engineers stood frozen, too stunned to speak. The old man didn't flinch. He simply nodded in acknowledgement. "This old man fixed it." One engineer finally stammered, his voice filled with awe. The commander's expression shifted as he studied the janitor. He stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You know this vehicle?" he asked. The janitor didn't respond. He just looked at the commander, his eyes clear and steady, as if they had already shared a history. The commander, a veteran himself, suddenly seemed to recognize something in the janitor's gaze. He turned to the engineers and said, "Get back to work." Then, without another word, he left the garage, his mind racing. What he hadn't known was that the janitor wasn't just a janitor. He was a veteran of countless missions, a master of military machinery. And the base commander had just stumbled upon a legend. The engineers were left standing there, mouths agape, staring at the Humvee that now roared to life after the old janitor's quiet intervention. The engine hummed, a smooth, powerful sound that indicated the vehicle was back in working order. They had spent hours trying to get the same result, and yet, in just a few minutes, the janitor had fixed what they couldn't. The young engineers, previously so confident in their modern technology, couldn't hide their awe. They had underestimated him. But now, they were forced to confront a truth they weren't prepared for. The commander, who had stepped out of his office after hearing the noise, observed the scene with a keen eye. He knew the value of experience, especially when it came to military machinery. He had been in this situation before. The janitor, however, was different. There was something in his gaze that suggested there was more to him than met the eye. The commander wasn't a fool. He had seen veterans like this man before, silent, unassuming, but capable of feats that would leave younger, more arrogant soldiers questioning their own abilities. After the engine had started, the commander walked up to the veteran, his steps deliberate and steady, his face reflecting the curiosity that had suddenly taken hold of him. "How long have you been working here?" he asked, his voice low but filled with a sense of respect. The janitor looked at him for a long moment, his eyes unblinking, as though assessing the commander before speaking. "Long enough," he replied quietly, his voice rough but steady. "Long enough to know how things work around here." The commander frowned slightly, his mind racing. "I didn't realize we had someone with your expertise on base. You're not just a janitor, are you?" The janitor didn't respond immediately, his gaze shifting momentarily to the Humvee, then back to the commander. There was a pause, and the commander sensed that the old man was weighing his words carefully. Finally, the janitor nodded. "I've worked on a lot of vehicles in my time. Some you'd never think twice about, but they all have their own quirks. You just need to know how to listen." The commander studied him, a mixture of surprise and recognition in his eyes. There was something familiar about the way the veteran spoke, as though he had been through 1,000 battles, and every word he said was etched with the weight of experience. The silence stretched between them for a moment before the commander spoke again. "I was in the field, too," he said, his voice softening slightly. "I've seen my share of broken machines, but nothing like this." He gestured to the Humvee. "It's hard to explain. It's like you just knew exactly what was wrong with it." The janitor's face remained impassive, but his eyes narrowed just slightly. "Sometimes, it's not about what's wrong. It's about knowing what needs to be done." The commander stood there, lost in thought for a moment, as the words lingered in the air. He knew this wasn't just some janitor fixing a vehicle. This man was something more. Someone who had seen things, done things, that no one would believe unless they had lived through it. "You've done this before, haven't you?" the commander asked, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. The janitor's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, the years seemed to fall away. The rough exterior, the age lines on his face, they were all just part of the mask. Inside, there was something else, something unspoken. "I've done it more times than you'd care to know," he said finally. The commander nodded, his expression serious. He turned to the engineers, who were still standing by, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "You all need to understand something," he said, his voice carrying authority. "This man knows more than all of us put together when it comes to fixing these machines. He's earned the right to be here." The engineers exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of what to make of the commander's words. But one thing was certain, they would never look at the janitor the same way again. The commander turned back to the veteran, a small but respectful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're not just a janitor, are you?" The janitor gave a small, knowing smile in return. "No, sir. I'm not." The commander's eyes narrowed, as if trying to figure out just who this man really was. He wasn't a soldier, at least not in the uniformed sense, but there was something about him, something unshakable. "Then what do you prefer to be called?" The janitor stood up, wiping his hands on his jumpsuit. He looked the commander directly in the eye and, for the first time, spoke his truth. "Call me whatever you like. Just know that I've been where it counts." There was no need for further explanation. The commander understood, and in that moment, he knew he had just uncovered a legend, hidden in plain sight, wearing the humble clothes of a janitor. The silence that followed spoke volumes. The respect was mutual, and the engineers, now fully aware of their own inadequacies, stood back, knowing they had witnessed something far beyond their understanding. The commander stood still for a moment, watching the old man, his thoughts racing. He had worked with soldiers and engineers all his life, but never had he encountered someone like this janitor. The calmness in the man's eyes spoke volumes, as if he had lived 1,000 lifetimes and seen everything the world could throw at him. The veteran's silence was powerful, and it spoke of battles fought, of missions accomplished under impossible circumstances. The commander had no doubt now. This was no ordinary man. As the engineers slowly returned to their tasks, still unsure of what to make of the situation, the commander turned and walked out of the garage. He needed to make some calls. Something wasn't right. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this janitor than met the eye. Back in his office, The commander sat at his desk, staring at his phone. He hesitated for a moment before dialing a number he hadn't called in years. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Colonel Hayes," the voice said, warm yet authoritative. "Colonel, it's me," the commander replied. "I need a favor. Something strange is going on at the base." The colonel's voice grew more serious. "What's going on?" "There's a man here," the commander began, his voice low. "A janitor. But he's not just a janitor. I think he's someone important, someone with a history we don't know." "You think he's former military?" Colonel Hayes asked. "I don't know," the commander replied. "But I've seen that look before. The way he carried himself. It's like he's been through something that none of us could ever imagine." Colonel Hayes was quiet for a moment. "I'll look into it," he said finally. "You think he's connected to anything we should be concerned about?" "I'm not sure," the commander said. "But I want to know who he really is." "I'll have some people check," Colonel Hayes replied. "I'll call you back." The commander hung up the phone, still unsettled by the encounter. He had dealt with soldiers who had seen combat, veterans who had survived the worst war zones. But this was different. The janitor had a presence that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't long before the commander received a call back from Colonel Hayes. "I've got some information," the colonel said, his voice tense. "You're not going to believe this." "What do you mean?" the commander asked, leaning forward in his chair. "I dug into the records," Colonel Hayes continued. "And it turns out that this janitor, this man you're talking about, is a legend. His name is Elias Vance." The commander's heart skipped a beat. Elias Vance. The name sounds familiar, but I can't place it. "You wouldn't have," Colonel Hayes said. "This man is a ghost. A legend in the military world. He's been out of the public eye for years, but back in his prime, he was one of the best. He's a combat veteran, and not just any veteran. He was part of a classified mission back in the late 70s. One that was so secretive that it was wiped from the official records." The commander sat back in his chair, stunned. "A secret mission?" "Yes," Colonel Hayes said. "He was part of a covert team that conducted high-risk operations deep behind enemy lines. No one knows exactly what they did, but they were responsible for some of the most dangerous and daring rescues ever conducted. Elias Vance was their leader." The commander couldn't believe what he was hearing. "And now he's working as a janitor?" he asked. "It doesn't make sense." "He left the military after a series of operations that almost killed him," Colonel Hayes explained. "He was injured, and when he came back, he just disappeared from the radar. No one knew what happened to him, but rumors started swirling. Some say he retired in peace. Others claim he went into hiding. And now he's here, working as a janitor," the commander repeated. "It doesn't make sense." "I'm telling you," Colonel Hayes said. "This man is a living legend. He's the kind of person who never seeks attention. He's done more than most soldiers could ever dream of." The commander was silent for a moment, processing the information. "So what do we do?" he asked. "I'll bring him in," Colonel Hayes replied. "I'll get a team together. If he's really who we think he is, we need to get him back into action. He's not just some retired soldier. He's a resource we've been overlooking." The commander nodded, feeling a deep sense of respect and awe for the man who had once been nothing more than a janitor in his eyes. "Get him here," the commander said. "I want to meet him." The colonel agreed, and soon enough, a convoy of military vehicles rolled up to the base. The janitor, Elias Vance, was escorted into the commander's office with the quiet authority that only someone of his caliber could exude. As the door opened, the commander stood up, his mind racing with the weight of the revelation. Elias Vance stepped into the room, looking every bit the part of the humble janitor he had appeared to be, but with an undeniable presence that filled the space. The commander extended his hand, his respect evident. "Elias Vance," the commander said, his voice filled with awe. "It's an honor to finally meet you." Elias Vance nodded, his eyes calm and steady, but there was a hint of sadness there, as though he had seen too much to ever be fully at peace. "The honor's mine, sir," he said quietly. "I've been around a long time." The commander nodded, his voice firm. "I've heard the stories. It's time to bring you back into the fold." Elias Vance didn't flinch. "I've never really left," he said. "I've just been waiting." The commander smiled, understanding more in that moment than he ever had before. This wasn't just a veteran. This was a hero, one who had been waiting for the right time to return to action. And now, that time had come. The commander's office was quiet, the weight of the revelation settling in the air. Elias Vance stood before him, a figure of calm amidst the storm of thoughts racing through the commander's mind. The man who had been a ghost in the military world for decades was now standing in front of him, and the commander knew that everything was about to change. "I never thought I'd see the day," the commander said, his voice low. Elias Vance, the janitor who had silently fixed the Humvee, wasn't just a man with skills, he was a man with a past, one that could change the future of their operations. Elias didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, his eyes steady, his presence commanding yet not demanding. "What exactly have you been doing since you left the military?" the commander asked, trying to piece together the mystery of this man's life. Elias shifted slightly, his gaze never wavering. "I've been waiting," he said quietly. "For what?" the commander asked, his curiosity piqued. "For a purpose," Elias replied. The words hung in the air, and the commander could feel the weight of them, as if they carried the story of a lifetime. Elias didn't need to say more. The commander understood. Elias had lived through the most difficult of times, but now, with the world changing, the time had come for him to return. "I don't know how much you've heard," the commander continued, "but things are about to get complicated around here. Our unit is facing some serious challenges. We need someone with experience, someone who's been through it all." Elias met his gaze with a quiet intensity. "I've been through things you can't imagine," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of a man who had seen more than his fair share of horrors. The commander knew that. He had felt it the moment he met Elias. This was a man who had lived through it all and come out the other side, a man whose wisdom and experience could never be replaced by technology or fancy equipment. "We need you," the commander said finally, his voice firm. "You're not just a janitor. You're a legend, and it's time we recognize that." Elias didn't smile. There was no need. He had never sought recognition. But something in his eyes softened, just for a moment, as if the commander's words had struck a chord. "I'm not interested in recognition," Elias said. "I'm interested in getting the job done, whatever it takes." The commander nodded, understanding fully. "That's exactly what we need." Elias didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked toward the door, the commander following him with his eyes. The moment felt surreal, as if something had shifted in the very foundation of the base. Elias wasn't just a veteran. He was the key to unlocking something greater. As they walked out of the office, the commander could feel the eyes of the men and women in the hallway on them. They didn't know who Elias was. They didn't know the weight of his name, the depth of his legacy. But they would learn soon enough. The commander was about to change everything. They made their way to the operations center, where a group of officers and strategists were already waiting. The room fell silent as Elias walked in. It wasn't just his presence that commanded attention. It was the quiet authority he carried with him, the unspoken respect that followed him wherever he went. The officers exchanged uncertain glances, not sure what to make of the old man in front of them. But the commander wasn't about to waste time explaining. "This is Elias Vance," the commander announced, "and he's here to help us." The officers looked confused, some even skeptical. "He's just a janitor," one of them muttered, his voice low enough to avoid being heard by Elias. The commander's eyes flashed with intensity. "You're wrong," he said, his tone sharp. "This man is a legend. He's one of the most capable soldiers I've ever known, and he's seen things none of you could even imagine." The room went silent. Elias didn't flinch at the remark. He didn't even react. He simply stood there, observing the officers with the quiet confidence that came from years of experience. "We've been dealing with a string of failed operations," the commander continued. "We need someone who understands the value of hard work, of getting things done with whatever resources we have. Elias is that person." Elias nodded, his eyes scanning the room as if he were already assessing the situation. "What's the plan?" he asked, his voice calm but direct. The commander gestured to the large map on the wall, where various military assets were marked with pins and lines. "We've got a series of failed missions coming up, and we don't have the manpower to recover. The enemy is moving fast, and our usual tactics aren't working. We need someone who can think outside the box." Elias studied the map for a moment, his eyes moving over the details. "I've seen this before," he said, his voice low but carrying authority. "The enemy moves fast, but they also have weaknesses. You just have to know where to strike." The officers in the room exchanged looks, clearly impressed. Elias hadn't even blinked at the complexity of the situation. He saw it as if it were a simple puzzle, one he had solved 1,000 times before. "We'll get it done," Elias said, turning to the commander. "I'll need a team, and I'll need some equipment." The commander nodded, his respect for Elias growing by the second. "You'll have everything you need." And just like that, Elias Vance, the man who had been nothing more than a janitor in the eyes of the engineers, was now leading the charge. The team would soon learn that when you've been through the fire, there's nothing that can stand in your way. The operation had begun. Elias Vance stood at the front of the briefing room, a quiet but commanding presence as the team gathered around the large table. The tension was palpable. The engineers, officers, and military strategists were all there, each person brimming with questions about the man who had gone from a janitor to the key player in their operation. The commander had already made it clear Elias was in charge. The mission they were about to embark on was critical. They had received intel about enemy movements in the area, and every second counted. The usual tactics weren't enough to get through this one. The enemy was too prepared, too mobile. The solution was simple. Elias had to show them how to think differently. "We're going to hit them where it hurts," Elias said, his voice calm but sure. "They'll never see us coming." The team exchanged nervous glances. Elias wasn't a man of many words, but his confidence was evident. He wasn't just talking about the enemy's weakness. He was showing them how to exploit it. The plan was straightforward, but daring. Elias intended to use the base's existing resources, vehicles, weapons, and manpower, but he had a unique approach. It wasn't about force or brute strength. It was about strategy, precision, and understanding the terrain. "We know where they're headed," Elias continued, pointing to the map on the wall. "And we know how they'll move. What we don't know is their real objective. So, we're going to force their hand." He outlined the operation. They would split the team into smaller units, each tasked with a different objective, all designed to confuse and scatter the enemy. "We're not just going to fight them," Elias said. "We're going to outthink them." The room fell silent. No one doubted his ability to lead, but this was a different kind of mission. No one had ever done anything quite like this before. Elias wasn't offering guarantees. He was offering a challenge, one that only someone with his kind of experience could pull off. The team, initially hesitant, began to warm up to the idea. It was risky, yes, but they trusted Elias. He had earned their respect, even without ever saying a word about his past. Hours later, they were moving out, the convoy snaking through the base as they prepared for the mission. The plan was in motion, but there was a sense of unease among the soldiers. Everyone was on edge. Elias, however, was calm, moving through the camp with a quiet confidence that reassured the others. As they neared the target location, the intensity of the mission hit them all at once. The enemy had set up camp nearby, and it was clear they were preparing for something big. Elias gave the order for the units to spread out. Each team moved in different directions, staying low and quiet. The first phase was already underway, and no one could afford a mistake. The night was eerily silent as the teams infiltrated their positions. Elias moved through the shadows, his footsteps light but purposeful. He was in his element now, operating like he had all those years ago when he led covert operations behind enemy lines. He wasn't just a man with a gun. He was a tactician, a strategist who understood the art of warfare in a way most others didn't. The first contact came just after midnight. The enemy patrol had no idea they were being watched. Elias's team was ready, and the ambush went off without a hitch. The enemy soldiers were caught off guard, their movement disrupted as the team took them down one by one. It was clean, it was efficient, and it sent a clear message to the enemy. They were not alone. The battle had only just begun, and the enemy was starting to feel the pressure. But this was just the beginning of Elias's plan. The real objective was still in play. The team moved forward, their nerves sharp as they got closer to the heart of the enemy's operation. As they neared their destination, Elias turned to the commander, his face serious. "We hit them hard," he said, "but we need to finish this now." The commander nodded, his trust in Elias unquestionable. "You're in charge." With that, the final phase began. The team coordinated flawlessly, using the terrain to their advantage. The enemy was beginning to fall apart, their communication lines severed, their soldiers confused and disorganized. But the real kicker was Elias's final move. He had planned this from the beginning, using the enemy's own strategy against them. As the enemy scrambled to regroup, Elias's team launched the decisive blow, catching them in the perfect position. The enemy didn't stand a chance. By morning, the mission was complete. Elias's team had succeeded. The enemy forces were decimated, their plans disrupted, and their morale shattered. The base commander couldn't believe it. He had seen many operations in his time, but this was something else entirely. Elias hadn't just led them to victory. He had redefined the way they thought about combat. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were a team of thinkers, of strategists. And it had all come from one man, one veteran, who had lived through it all. The team gathered together, their faces tired but victorious. Elias stood at the center, a quiet figure in the midst of their celebration. He hadn't asked for glory, but it was clear he had earned it. "We did it," the commander said, his voice filled with respect. Elias simply nodded, his face unreadable. "We did," he replied quietly. And with that, the legend of Elias Vance, once just a janitor, had become a story that would be told for generations to come. The victory had been swift, but the aftermath was far from it. Elias Vance stood in the operations room, looking over the map spread out in front of him. The mission had been a success, but the enemy forces, though shattered, hadn't been completely neutralized. They had retreated, regrouped, and there was no telling when they might strike again. The mission was only half won. Elias's team had broken their lines, disrupted their communications, and destroyed critical supply routes, but the war wasn't over yet. "What's next?" the commander asked, his voice filled with curiosity, but also a tinge of apprehension. Elias's eyes remained locked on the map, his mind working through the next step in the plan. "We've hit them hard, but we need to make sure they can't recover," Elias said, his voice calm but sharp with purpose. "If we leave them to regroup, they'll come back stronger." The commander nodded. "We'll send in the backup teams," he said, though it was clear he trusted Elias's judgment more than anyone else's. Elias stood tall, his hand resting on the map as he outlined the next phase of the operation. "We need to take out their leadership. They may be scattered, but if we take down their command structure, they'll fall apart." The team was still reeling from the surprise of their success, and now they had to keep up the momentum. Elias wasn't just a tactical genius. He was a leader. He knew how to push people to their limits without overwhelming them. His plan was as bold as it was precise. He was the man who could think 10 steps ahead, and that's what made him invaluable. As they prepared for the next phase of the mission, the tension in the air was palpable. They had moved from one operation to another without pause, and the team was starting to feel the strain. Elias, however, was steady as a rock. He hadn't flinched once, not in the heat of battle, and certainly not now. "We move at dawn," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of finality. "We won't give them a chance to regroup." The commanders and officers who had been present for the first mission, now awed by Elias's calm, nodded in agreement. The plan was set, and there was no turning back. The next day, as the sun rose over the horizon, the team moved out again, ready to strike decisively. Elias's plan was simple but effective: target the remaining leadership and disrupt their final stronghold. The team moved with precision, their coordination flawless. They hit their first target, an enemy command post that had been communicating with the remaining forces. It was a clean operation, quiet and swift, just as Elias had promised. There were no surprises, no mistakes. Everything went according to plan. As they pushed forward, the enemy forces began to falter. Their lines grew weaker, their responses slower. Elias's strategy had worked. The enemy's leadership was crumbling, and they didn't know how to fight back. For the first time in the operation, the enemy was on the back foot. It wasn't long before Elias's team reached the heart of the enemy's remaining stronghold. They had tracked down their leader, the one pulling the strings from the shadows. The team was ready to strike the final blow. But Elias knew the final phase was always the most delicate. He knew what needed to be done. As they surrounded the compound, he turned to the commander, his face set with determination. "This is where it ends," he said. "We go in. We end it now." The commander nodded, trusting Elias completely. The team moved in as one, the silence of their approach almost deafening. They breached the compound with precision, taking out the enemy guards one by one, their movements synchronized like a well-oiled machine. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. Elias led them with calm efficiency, his every move calculated, his every decision flawless. Inside the compound, the enemy leader was waiting. He was a shadow of the man he once was, sitting behind a desk, a wall of monitors showing their defeat. The moment Elias entered the room, the enemy leader stood, his face a mixture of surprise and fear. He didn't know who this man was, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to win this fight. You were too late, the enemy leader sneered, but his words faltered under Elias's unflinching gaze. Elias didn't speak a word. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on the man, and with one swift motion, he ended the threat. The leadership of the enemy had been obliterated in one fell swoop. It was over. Elias stood there for a moment, breathing in the weight of the victory. The battle was won, but he knew better than anyone else that this wasn't the end. It was a chapter. The next one would begin soon enough. As the team gathered around, the commander walked up to Elias, his respect evident. "We couldn't have done this without you," the commander said. Elias, however, remained as humble as ever. "It's not about me," he replied, his voice low but steady. "It's about what we all do together. This team did it. I just helped guide them." The commander nodded. He knew that the true strength of Elias lay not just in his skills, but in his ability to make those around him better. With the mission accomplished, Elias looked toward the horizon, his mind already turning to what came next. The world may have thought of him as just a janitor, but he knew the truth. He was a soldier, a leader, and a legend. And as long as there was work to be done, he would be there to do it. The base had been quiet in the days following the operation. Elias and his team had returned to their usual routine, though nothing felt quite the same. There was a shift in the atmosphere, a new level of respect, and admiration for the man who had guided them to victory. The commanders, officers, and even the engineers who had once scoffed at Elias's abilities now looked at him with a mixture of awe and gratitude. His legend had only grown since that night, and the reality of who he was had finally sunk in. Elias, however, remained as humble as ever, quietly going about his duties. He had no interest in fame or accolades. His focus was always on the mission, on the task at hand. He had lived through too many wars, too many battles, to care about recognition. His only concern now was what came next. One evening, as the sun began to set over the base, Elias was called into the commander's office. The door opened with a soft creak, and the commander stood from his desk, a serious expression on his face. "Elias, we've got a new situation," he said, motioning for Elias to sit. Elias took a seat, his posture straight, his expression neutral. "What's the problem, sir?" he asked, his voice calm. "We've received intel that there's a new threat on the horizon," the commander said, sliding a file across the desk. "It's bigger than anything we've faced before. We need you to take charge." Elias's eyes narrowed as he picked up the file, scanning the contents. The report was filled with details about an enemy faction that was amassing power, slowly infiltrating key military installations and government positions. They were well organized, highly skilled, and their tactics were unlike anything the team had faced. "This is no ordinary threat," Elias muttered, his mind already working through the possibilities. "We're dealing with a different kind of enemy." The commander nodded. "Exactly. And that's why I need you to lead this operation. You've been through the toughest battles. You know what it takes to win." Elias didn't answer right away. He was already thinking about the team, about the strategies they would need. The risk was high, but the stakes were even higher. "You've got the green light," the commander added. "This is your mission, Elias. I'm putting the full trust of the base in your hands." Elias stood up, the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. "I'll take care of it," he said simply, his voice unwavering. "I won't let you down." The commander gave a slight nod, his eyes full of respect. "I know you won't." The next day, Elias gathered his team in the briefing room. They had been through many operations together, but this one was different. The room was filled with a quiet tension, everyone aware that what lay ahead would require everything they had. "This isn't going to be easy," Elias said, looking over his team. "We're dealing with a new kind of enemy, one that knows how to hide in plain sight. But we've got something they don't. We have experience, we have strategy, and we have each other." The team listened, their eyes fixed on Elias. They had seen him lead them through impossible situations before, and now, they were ready to follow him again. "The first phase of the mission will be reconnaissance," Elias continued, pointing to a map on the wall. We'll move in quietly, gather intel, and assess the situation. We can't afford to make any mistakes. He paused for a moment, letting the gravity of the mission settle in. Our job is to find out who's behind this, what they're planning, and how we can stop them before it's too late. The team nodded in agreement, each member preparing for the task ahead. Elias had a plan, and they trusted it. They trusted him. As the days passed, the team moved into position, infiltrating the enemy's network and slowly piecing together the puzzle. Elias's strategy was simple but effective. They had to be patient, careful. The enemy had spread out, using every tactic to hide their movements. But Elias wasn't fooled. He knew how to track them, how to expose their weaknesses. The team worked in shifts, staying alert and focused. They gathered intel, made contact with informants, and kept a close eye on enemy movements. The plan was working, but they hadn't struck yet. The operation was still in its early stages, and Elias knew the hardest part was still to come. After a week of meticulous planning and reconnaissance, Elias was ready. They had gathered enough information to launch their attack. The enemy's leadership had been located, and Elias knew exactly where they would strike. But this wasn't going to be a straightforward assault. Elias had learned long ago that the key to success wasn't always in brute force. Sometimes, it was about striking at the right time, when the enemy least expected it. The final phase of the mission was a high-risk operation, but Elias was confident. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "We're going in. We take them down now, or we risk everything." The team was ready. They had followed Elias through thick and thin, and now, they were about to face their biggest challenge yet. They moved swiftly, executing the plan with precision. They surrounded the enemy's compound, infiltrated their defenses, and before they knew it, the enemy was in disarray. Elias's team struck fast, dismantling the enemy's command structure and neutralizing key targets. It wasn't easy, but it was clean. Elias had led them to victory once again, but this time, the victory felt different. This time, it felt like the end of something much bigger. As the operation wound down, Elias stood at the center of it all, his eyes scanning the compound. The mission had been a success, but Elias knew better than anyone. This war was far from over. But for now, they had won. And that was enough. The operation was a success, but the aftermath left Elias with a sense of unease. The mission had been completed with precision. An enemy faction that once posed a significant threat had been dismantled. Their leadership was gone, their plans shattered. But even as the team celebrated their victory, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was still looming. There was always more to the story than what met the eye, and he knew better than anyone that peace was rarely permanent in the world they operated in. The following days were filled with the usual debriefing and cleanup. The command center was buzzing with activity, and the atmosphere was heavy with the weight of what had been accomplished. But for Elias, it wasn't enough to sit back and relax. He knew that the wheels of conflict were always turning, and while they had won this battle, the war wasn't over. As he walked through the base, Elias couldn't help but notice the way the soldiers and officers treated him now. The respect was palpable. They had seen what he was capable of, his quiet leadership, his unmatched experience, and his ability to turn the tide of a battle with calm precision. But Elias wasn't one for accolades. He wasn't here for the recognition. He was here because it was what he was born to do. In the briefing room, the commander approached him, his face serious but filled with gratitude. "Elias, I need you to lead one more mission," the commander said, his voice low. Elias looked up, his eyes sharp with interest. "What's the mission, sir?" he asked. "We've intercepted intel that suggests a new threat is emerging," the commander explained. "It's not just a group of rogue soldiers this time. We're looking at something much bigger. We need to strike before they have a chance to organize." Elias felt a shift in the air. This wasn't just another standard operation. The commander's tone, the urgency in his voice, it was different this time. "I'm listening," Elias said, his voice steady. "The mission is simple," the commander continued. "We have to infiltrate their base, gather intel, and neutralize the threat before it becomes more dangerous. But it's not just about the mission. It's about sending a message. If we don't stop them now, they'll have the chance to regroup and come back stronger. We can't afford that." Elias nodded, his mind already working through the logistics. "We need to move fast," he said. "I'll assemble the team." The team was already waiting when Elias arrived at the operations center. He could see the tension in their eyes, but they didn't need to say a word. They trusted him. They were ready. "This mission is crucial," Elias began, his voice commanding attention. "We're not just going in to fight. We're going in to end this before it grows beyond our control. There's no room for error. We move fast, we stay sharp, and we hit them where it hurts." The team nodded, their faces a mixture of determination and resolve. They had been through hell together, and now they were about to face another impossible mission. Elias laid out the plan, swift, precise, and deadly. They would infiltrate the enemy's stronghold, gather intelligence on their operations, and neutralize key targets. The objective was clear, end the threat before it had the chance to spread. "We don't leave anything to chance," Elias said. "We hit them hard, we hit them fast, and we leave no survivors." As the team prepared to move out, Elias couldn't help but feel the weight of the mission. This wasn't just another operation, it felt different. The stakes were higher, the risks greater. But Elias wasn't afraid. He knew what he was capable of. He had faced death more times than he could count, and each time, he had come out victorious. This mission would be no different. As they neared the enemy compound, the team moved with precision. The night was dark, the silence deafening. They infiltrated the base undetected, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. Elias led the way, his every move calculated, his focus razor-sharp. They reached their target location in record time. The enemy's defenses were stronger than anticipated, but Elias had expected that. He had already accounted for every possible scenario. "We're in," Elias whispered into his comms. "Move quickly, stay silent. We're taking them down one by one." The team moved through the compound, taking out guards without making a sound. Elias led them with the quiet authority that had earned him the respect of his team. They reached the control room, where the enemy was coordinating their operations. The time for subtlety was over. Elias gave the signal, and the team launched their assault. The fight was swift and brutal. The enemy didn't know what hit them. Elias's team struck with the precision of a well-oiled machine, neutralizing key targets and crippling their operations. The control room was theirs in moments, and the intel they gathered was invaluable. But they weren't done yet. Elias knew the real challenge was still ahead. The leader of the enemy faction was still at large. They had to neutralize him, or everything they had done so far would be for nothing. "We need to find him," Elias said, his voice cold and determined. Now, they moved through the compound, hunting down their final target. The enemy leader was cornered, and Elias's team closed in, ready to finish what they had started. But as they approached the leader's hideout, Elias hesitated. Something didn't feel right. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he motioned for the team to halt. "Something's off," Elias said, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "Stay alert." The team paused, the air thick with tension. Elias's instincts were never wrong. He had learned long ago to trust them. As they moved forward cautiously, Elias knew that this final confrontation would determine everything. Victory was within their grasp, but the real fight was just beginning. The tension in the air was thick as Elias and his team made their way through the enemy compound, the sound of their footsteps barely audible against the thick silence. Elias's instincts had been right. Something was off. The usual confidence he carried into a mission was tempered by the growing sense of unease creeping over him. He had faced down countless enemies in his time, but this felt different. They moved cautiously, weapons at the ready, as they approached the final target. Every corner they turned, every shadow that loomed seemed to hold the potential for danger. Elias led the way, as always, but this time, even his sharp eyes were scanning every inch of the environment. The building in front of them was heavily fortified, its walls lined with security measures. Elias had expected this. He knew the enemy wouldn't go down without a fight. But what he didn't expect was the unsettling quiet that filled the air. It was almost too quiet. "Stay sharp," Elias whispered to his team, his voice steady but carrying an edge of urgency. "We're not done yet." They reached the final hallway of the compound, and Elias motioned for the team to stop. His hand signaled for them to prepare for the assault. The leader of the enemy faction was just ahead, holed up in a fortified room at the end of the hall. Elias's mind raced through every possible scenario. They had already neutralized most of the enemy forces, but the leader was the real target. Without him, the rest of the faction would be a scattered mess. Elias didn't want to give him a chance to escape. He had to act quickly, decisively. On my mark, Elias said quietly, his voice low enough that only his team could hear. We move in fast, take him down, and leave no one behind. The team nodded, their faces set with determination. They trusted Elias. He had earned it. And now, as they prepared for the final strike, there was no room for hesitation. Elias's hand reached for the door handle, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. He could feel the pulse of the mission in his veins, the adrenaline kicking in. This was it, the end of the line. With a swift movement, he yanked the door open. The room beyond was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls. The enemy leader stood at the far end, his back to them, looking out a small window that overlooked the barren landscape. He didn't even flinch when the door slammed open. He knew they were coming. I knew you'd make it this far, the enemy leader said, his voice cold, without a hint of surprise. But you won't win. You can't win. Elias stepped into the room, his weapon aimed directly at the leader. It's over, Elias said, his voice calm but filled with certainty. You're done. The leader turned slowly, his eyes locking with Elias's. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by something darker, defiance. You think you've won? The leader sneered. You think taking me down will stop this? You're just a tool in a much bigger game. Elias's grip on his weapon tightened. The game's over, he replied. This ends now. The leader smiled, a twisted grin that sent a chill through the room. You really think you're in control here? He said, taking a step toward Elias. You don't know what you're up against. You've never even seen the full picture. Elias's eyes narrowed, his senses alert. He knew what the leader was doing, trying to sow doubt, trying to get under his skin. But Elias wasn't having it. I don't need to see the full picture, Elias said, his voice steady. I've seen enough to know that it's over for you. The leader's smile faded, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. He knew Elias was right. The end was inevitable. Elias didn't hesitate. With one smooth motion, he aimed his weapon and fired. The leader crumpled to the floor, his life extinguished in an instant. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment settling in. Elias didn't feel the rush of triumph that others might have in his place. He had been through too much, seen too much, to care about personal victory. What mattered was that the mission had been completed. The enemy was defeated, their leader gone. But as Elias stood there, looking down at the fallen man, a voice in his head couldn't help but wonder, what had the leader meant by his last words? Was there truly a bigger threat out there, waiting for them? It wasn't the first time Elias had encountered a leader with an air of invincibility, but the leader's words had felt different. Still, Elias pushed those thoughts aside for the moment. He had done his job. He had completed the mission. His team had followed him, and now they were safe. The mission's complete, Elias said to his team, his voice breaking the silence. Let's get out of here. As they made their way back to the extraction point, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the leader's words would haunt him. He had won this battle, but the war? That was something different. He knew better than anyone that the world was always changing, always shifting. And while this mission had been completed, he had a sinking feeling that the true fight was far from over. For now, though, Elias would rest. He had earned it. But in the back of his mind, the weight of the future pressed down on him. There was more to come. He just didn't know when it would hit. The mission was considered a success, and the base was beginning to breathe easier. The dust had settled, the enemy leader was neutralized, and the immediate threat had been dealt with. But Elias felt no relief. For him, the battle had always been about the bigger picture, about something deeper than just winning a fight. As he walked through the base, he could see the men and women around him carrying on with their routines, trying to move forward, but Elias knew the truth. Something wasn't right. His mind replayed the final moments of the operation, the leader's last words. There had been a sense of finality in the room when the shot was fired, but Elias couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. More to the threat they had just barely managed to stop. Elias had fought too many wars to believe in simple endings. He had seen too many supposed victories turn into new battles, new enemies. The world was always shifting, and the idea of a clean-cut conclusion was something he had learned to dismiss long ago. As days passed, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the words from the enemy leader still echoed in his mind. You've never even seen the full picture. It was a simple sentence, yet it weighed heavily on him. What did the leader mean by that? Was it just a last attempt at discrediting them, or was there something more he was hinting at? Elias spent sleepless nights trying to piece it together. He couldn't afford to ignore it. It wasn't just the mission that worried him. It was the idea that they had been caught in something much larger than a single operation. One night, after the debriefing, Elias was called back to the commander's office. This time, the air felt different, tense, heavy with the kind of anticipation that told him something wasn't right. The commander stood behind his desk, his posture stiff. "Elias, we need to talk," he said, his voice grim. Elias stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He could sense the change in the commander's demeanor. "What's going on?" Elias asked. "We've been getting more intel," the commander said, sliding a new file across the desk. "This is bigger than we thought. There's been a shift in the enemy's strategy. We've confirmed that there are remnants of the faction we thought we'd destroyed. They've been moving in the shadows, organizing, and gathering resources. And we've received reports of new players entering the field, players we didn't even know existed." Elias didn't need to read the file to understand the gravity of the situation. He had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "How big are we talking?" Elias asked, his voice low and steady. "We're talking about an underground network, Elias," the commander said, his eyes darkening. "This faction wasn't just one leader. It's a much larger operation, global in scope. And now, it's spreading. The question is, how do we stop it before it grows beyond control?" Elias took a moment to process the information. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on him. This wasn't just another mission. This was a war on a scale he hadn't prepared for. "We go after them," Elias said finally, his voice resolute. "We strike at the heart of the operation. We find out who's behind this and take them down before they can escalate." The commander nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "I'm with you, Elias, but this is bigger than anything we've dealt with before. We'll need every resource we've got, and then some. Are you ready for that?" Elias didn't hesitate. "I've been ready." The commander sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Good. I knew I could count on you." As Elias left the office, the weight of the new mission began to settle in. He couldn't shake the feeling that the true battle had only just begun. They weren't fighting a rogue faction anymore. This was something much larger, something that could spread across borders, across continents. Elias knew that the enemy they were about to face wasn't just a group of soldiers. It was an ideology, a network built on secrecy and manipulation. They would have to fight smarter, not harder. The fight would be invisible, fought in the shadows, and only the most calculated and relentless would survive. The next day, Elias called the team together. They had to move quickly and silently. The world didn't know it yet, but they were already in the midst of a global fight for control. The first step was simple: find the leaders of this underground faction, track them down, and eliminate them before they could do any more damage. But Elias knew it wouldn't be easy. They would need all their training, all their skills, to uncover the true scope of the operation. "We're going after the ones who pull the strings," Elias said, his voice steady. "This time, we don't just take out soldiers. We take down the entire structure. No more playing by their rules." The team was silent, but there was no need for words. They had already seen what Elias was capable of. They knew the stakes. "Get ready," Elias said. "This is going to be the hardest fight of our lives." As the team prepared to leave, Elias couldn't help but feel that the mission ahead would push them all to their limits. But he was ready. They were all ready. The world was about to change again, and this time, Elias wouldn't stop until they had won for good. The mission was set into motion without hesitation. Elias and his team had gathered everything they needed for the upcoming operation: intelligence, resources, and the unwavering resolve to stop the growing threat. As they prepared to leave the base, the weight of what they were about to undertake settled over them like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just another mission. This was the moment they would either prevent an international catastrophe or fail to stop something that could spiral out of control. Elias had led his team through difficult operations before, but this was different. The stakes were higher, the enemies were smarter, and they were going up against a network that operated in the shadows. The first leg of their journey was methodical. They were traveling under the radar, staying off the usual tracking systems, using old routes that only a few still remembered. They had to move in silence, gather their intel, and prepare to strike before the enemy even realized they were coming. Elias led the way, his mind already working through every possible scenario. He didn't just rely on tactics, he relied on instinct, something he had honed over decades of warfare. "We're not going in blind," he said to his team, his voice steady but firm. "We know where they are, but we need to know who's pulling the strings. Our first step is to find the top leadership. Once we have them, we can dismantle the entire operation." The team nodded, understanding the gravity of the task ahead. They had seen Elias work in action before, and they knew he was right. Every operation had to be calculated, every move deliberate. The enemy had no idea they were being hunted, and that was how Elias wanted it. The quiet before the storm. The team arrived at the location, a remote facility deep within enemy territory. From the outside, it appeared to be a small, inconspicuous compound, almost harmless. But Elias knew better. The real threat was always hidden in plain sight. "This is it," he said as they approached the perimeter. "Remember the plan. Stay low, stay quiet, and don't engage unless it's absolutely necessary." The team moved in, cloaked in darkness, using the cover of night to blend in with their surroundings. They were ghosts, moving through the shadows, silent and unseen. As they infiltrated the compound, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His senses were on high alert. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts. And right now, his instincts were telling him they weren't the only ones on the move. They reached the first set of security checkpoints, and Elias signaled for the team to stop. He gestured for one of the junior officers to check the perimeter. The officer moved quickly, returning within minutes. "There's a breach," the officer said, his voice low but filled with urgency. "They know we're here. They've activated their backup systems." Elias's mind raced. This was unexpected. The enemy had set a trap, but it was too late. They were already inside. "Change of plans," Elias said, his voice calm, but carrying authority. "We move in faster, neutralize any threats, and get the intel we need." No hesitation. The team followed his lead, slipping past guards, disabling surveillance systems, and moving deeper into the compound. The tension in the air was palpable, but Elias remained as composed as ever. His focus was laser-sharp. Nothing could distract him now. The final objective was within reach, the leadership they had come to stop. The mission had always been about taking down the heart of the operation. They reached the command center, and Elias positioned his team around the perimeter. They were ready to strike. But as they prepared to enter, Elias held up a hand. "Wait," he said. "Something's off. We need to be sure this is the real target." The team paused, confusion flickering on their faces. "We've been tracking these coordinates for weeks," one of the officers said. "It's them, Elias. This is where they are." Elias studied the compound's layout, his eyes narrowing as he pieced together the information. Something didn't add up. "The leader is here," he said finally, his voice low and deliberate. "But they're expecting us. This is too easy. They've set a trap for us." The team braced for action, but Elias wasn't finished. "We can't just go in guns blazing," he continued. "We have to think smarter. We can't risk being cornered." The team looked to Elias for guidance. He knew how to lead them through chaos. They trusted him completely. "We'll split up," Elias decided. "We'll create confusion and get them to come to us. We'll take out their communications and disorient them before we make our move." The team moved out, each member executing their task with precision. Elias led a small group to disable the enemy's communication systems, ensuring that they couldn't send reinforcements. As they moved through the compound, the chaos erupted. The enemy forces scrambled to react, their well-laid plans falling apart. It wasn't long before Elias and his team reached the heart of the compound, the leader's command center. The moment of truth had arrived. Elias could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him, but he pushed it aside. This was what he was trained for. This was his moment. They breached the command center. Inside, the enemy leader stood, a look of shock on his face as he realized the trap he had set had failed. Elias walked in calmly, his eyes fixed on the man before him. "It's over," Elias said, his voice cold and final. The leader didn't speak. He knew it was over too. Elias stepped forward, his team closing in around him. The mission was complete. The leader fell, and with him, the organization that had threatened global security. Elias stood over the man, his heart beating steadily in his chest. The mission had been a success, but Elias knew better. There was always another fight waiting on the horizon. The compound was silent in the aftermath of the mission. The team had done what they came to do, eliminate the threat. The enemy leader was gone, and with him, the network that had caused so much chaos. Elias stood among the wreckage, his mind already moving on to what came next. The mission had been successful, but it wasn't over. It never was. As the team gathered around, their faces tired but satisfied, Elias couldn't help but feel the weight of the victory settling on his shoulders. They had struck a serious blow, but the ripple effect of their actions would be felt worldwide. This was just the first step in a much larger war, one that wouldn't end with this single victory. The command center was a mess of destroyed equipment, shattered monitors, and scattered papers. Elias took a moment to look over the scene, his mind processing the success, the cost, and the new reality they faced. As the last of the enemy forces were secured, Elias turned to his team, his eyes sharp. "We've won this round," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "But the war is still out there. This wasn't just about taking down one faction. It's about sending a message. We're not done." The team nodded, knowing full well what Elias meant. They weren't in it for the glory, they were in it for the long haul. And with each mission, each victory, the enemy was only growing more desperate, more dangerous. As they made their way back to the extraction point, Elias's mind wandered back to the moment when they had cornered the enemy leader. He had seen something in the man's eyes, something other than fear. There had been a flicker of understanding, as if the leader knew exactly who was standing before him. Elias didn't believe in coincidences. He had been in the game too long to think this was a simple victory. There was something bigger at play. "Elias," the commander said, pulling him from his thoughts. "I think we need to have a conversation." Elias looked over at the commander, who was walking alongside him, his expression serious. "What's on your mind?" "It's about the larger network," the commander replied, his voice low. "I've been reviewing the intel, and there's something we missed. There's a larger force behind these factions. We're not just dealing with rogue groups. This is something organized, something bigger, and it's moving fast." Elias's eyes narrowed. He had suspected as much. The leader's last words had echoed in his mind, and now, the commander was confirming his fears. "What do you want to do about it?" Elias asked. "We need to hit them before they can regroup," the commander said, his voice firm. "We've seen the scale of this operation, and it's only going to get worse if we don't act." Elias nodded, already processing the next steps in his mind. "We'll need more resources," he said, "and we'll need to act quickly. If this is as big as you say, we can't afford to waste any time." "I agree," the commander replied. "We'll mobilize everything we can. I'm giving you the green light for a full-scale operation. We need to find the heart of this network and destroy it." Elias didn't need to be told twice. He had seen what the enemy was capable of, and he knew that if they didn't stop this now, they would regret it. He turned to his team, who were already assembling in the operations center. "We've got a bigger fight ahead of us," he said, his voice steady. "This isn't just about eliminating a faction. This is about stopping an entire network from destroying everything we've worked for. We move fast, we stay sharp, and we don't leave anyone behind. We're in this together." The team's expressions hardened, their resolve set. They had been through too much together to back down now. They were ready for whatever came next. As the team prepared for the next phase of the mission, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to enter something far more dangerous than they had ever faced. The enemy was no longer just a group of terrorists or insurgents. This was something more insidious, something global. He turned to the map laid out on the table in front of them, studying the enemy's known locations, their movements, and the patterns they had left behind. It was all starting to come together. This was a war on a global scale, and they were only seeing the tip of the iceberg. The intelligence they had gathered pointed to multiple cells spread across continents, each with its own network, but all connected by one central force. Elias knew that if they didn't dismantle it all at once, they would never be able to stop it. The next day, they launched their operation. The team hit the ground running, using all the intel they had gathered to infiltrate the enemy's cells. It was a race against time, but Elias had done this enough times to know how to play the game. The operation was swift, brutal, and effective. One by one, the enemy's bases were neutralized, their leaders captured or eliminated. But the deeper they went, the more they realized that this network was far more organized than they had first believed. They were dealing with a shadow government, an operation so well hidden that even their best intel couldn't uncover it all. Elias's instincts were right. This wasn't just another mission. It was the beginning of a long, difficult fight that would stretch them all to their limits. But as they moved forward, Elias knew one thing for sure. They would stop at nothing to see this through to the end. The war had only just begun. The mission had reached its final stage. After weeks of relentless pursuit, Elias and his team had managed to break through the enemy's defenses, dismantling their global network piece by piece. The last of the enemy's strongholds was in sight, an underground facility, heavily guarded and fortified. This was where it would all end, where they would either succeed or face the consequences of failure. Elias stood in front of the operations map, studying the layout of the facility. His team, battle-worn and exhausted, was ready for what came next. But Elias knew this would be their hardest task yet. It wasn't just about defeating the enemy. It was about erasing the threat they posed to the world. The facility was buried deep underground, with layers of security systems that could keep anyone out or trap them inside. But Elias had been through worse. His instincts told him the key to success wasn't in brute force. It was in precision, in hitting the heart of the operation before the enemy could react. "This is it," Elias said to his team, his voice calm but filled with a sense of finality. "We get in, we take down the leadership, and we shut this down for good. No more distractions, no more waiting." The team nodded, their expressions set with determination. They had been through hell together, and they knew Elias was right. This wasn't just about stopping the network. It was about ending the war they had been fighting for so long. They moved in quickly, using every ounce of training they had. The facility was tight, cramped, and full of potential threats at every corner. But Elias led them with steady resolve, never wavering, always thinking 2 steps ahead. As they reached the inner core of the compound, they encountered their first line of defense, armed guards who had been alerted to their presence. The fight was fast and brutal, but Elias's team moved with precision, taking down the guards without hesitation. They were on a mission, and nothing would stop them. "Keep moving," Elias ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We've got one shot at this. Don't slow down." They pressed forward, cutting through the enemy's defenses, until they reached the central command room. There, in the heart of the facility, stood the remaining leaders of the faction. They were unprepared for what was about to hit them. Elias stood at the entrance, his eyes cold and focused. He had seen the destruction these men had caused, the pain they had inflicted on so many. This was personal. "It's over," Elias said, his voice steady. The enemy leader, standing at the center of the room, looked up in surprise. For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew who Elias was. He knew what he represented. "You think you've won?" the leader sneered, his voice filled with contempt. "You don't even understand the game you're playing. We've already won. You're just too blind to see it." Elias stepped forward, his eyes locking with the leader's. He didn't care about the words. He cared about the outcome. "It's over," Elias repeated, his tone final. The leader tried to make a move, reaching for a weapon, but Elias was faster. In a flash, the leader was on the ground, defeated. The rest of the team moved in, securing the room, ensuring that the threat was neutralized. The mission was complete. Elias stood in the center of the room, his heart pounding, his mind racing. This was the moment they had been waiting for, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the calm before another storm. The fight had been won, but the war was far from over. "Mission accomplished," Elias said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of what lay ahead. His team gathered around him, their faces a mixture of relief and exhaustion. They had completed the task, but Elias knew that their work was never truly done. The world was always changing, and there would always be another fight. But for now, they had won. The threat had been eliminated. The enemy was no more. Elias felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. This battle was over, but he couldn't help but wonder what would come next. He had fought many wars in his life, but the fight he had just finished felt different. It had been long, drawn out, and full of uncertainty. The battle had ended, but the scars would remain. The team made their way back to base, and as they left the facility behind, Elias took one last look at the now silent compound. They had finished it, but somewhere deep inside, he knew that peace was fleeting. There would always be another war, another battle. The mission was over, But for Elias, the fight would never truly end. In this emotional story, we follow Elias Vance, a battle-hardened veteran turned janitor who uncovers a global conspiracy and leads a team to dismantle a dangerous enemy network. The journey begins with Elias taking on what seems like an impossible mission, using his tactical expertise and unparalleled experience to guide his team through complex operations. This emotional story captures the highs and lows of their fight, from initial victories to the realization that the true enemy is much larger than anticipated. Elias's leadership and wisdom are put to the test as the team confronts a shadow organization determined to undermine global security. Every step in this emotional story brings them closer to an endgame, but Elias soon discovers that even after the last enemy leader falls, the battle is far from over. With every decision, the emotional toll of the fight weighs heavily on Elias, showing that even in victory, the scars of war never truly fade. This emotional story shows the relentless pursuit of justice and the sacrifices made along the way. It's not just about winning battles. It's about facing the unknown, overcoming obstacles, and finding strength in moments of doubt. Elias's journey is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds, making this emotional story a gripping and unforgettable experience.